Ooh, look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? Hold still, buddy. You are beautiful. Yeah. This is our beautiful Hannah. This is a Corriedale face. Look at that muzzle. I'm thinking you can see here why coats can be so helpful. Let's see if I get this parted. Can you see? Here's the part of her fleece that isn't covered. Now granted, this is her head where she'd be sticking it in to get the hay. Listen to that wind out there. Let's see what that looks like. Let me see if I can get a hand under her coat to show you. Now I've slid her coat back a little bit. You see that? It's going to blow out a little bit, but look at that. There's a little mud. Come back here. Put that. Or this. She doesn't even look like a white sheep up here. And that's why we wear coats at Serenity Farms. Yeah. I'm starting to realize that I really overthink this podcast thing. In an effort to tell my story without ever seeming critical of others or offensive to anyone, I record and then I edit, then I re-record because I think I sound too harsh. Then I scrap everything all together. For this yarn failure segment, I really wanted to be sure that I didn't seem like I was being critical of the fiber mills who work so hard and do so much for us fiber people, because I'm not. This was just an effort to point out what can happen, pitfalls that you need to be aware of. These people are friends as well as business people, and Lord knows they put up with a lot of crap, literally, from poop in the wool to just crap from people. So we need to be kind and patient and supportive of the mills as they are of us. And like I said, a lot of the people from these mills are friends as well as business people. So throughout this segment, I'm not going to name names of the different mills that some of these mistakes were processed at. There are 3 different mills represented over the course of 6 or 7 years here. And as much as the mistakes cost us in time and money, it does them as well. And they also have each of the different mills have made beautiful yarn for us. So, you know, it's worth trying again. But we do hear occasionally about what can happen from the fiber mill part. I wanted to show you what happens from the producer's part, and to talk a little bit about yarn here at Serenity Farms and My Wool Mitten going forward. So with that out of the way, let's get to the stories of the yarns. First off, let me apologize. I'm running the washer and dryer, and you may be able to hear that in the background. So I apologize if you can. I'm going to try to run through this a little bit more quickly. I recorded this once, but as usual, I rambled on and on. By now I will have told you about how we started out with fleeces and fibers, what our program was as producers to sell the wool that we didn't keep for ourselves. We had waiting lists for fleece every year and sold out every year, and that was a good thing to do. And I tell you that not in a way of bragging or being smug, but to say we had a pretty good thing going that way. At the time, and this would have been about 6 years ago that I tried to produce this first yarn, a couple of things. I wanted to promote Corriedale more. I wanted to promote an all-natural sock yarn. I was teaching spinning for sock yarn and learning to knit socks. And, you know, there's always been a lot of discussion about what makes a good sock yarn. And at that time, the standard for all-natural fibers was wool and mohair, generally, if you wanted an all-natural fiber. But I found that wool and a small amount of alpaca worked very well for me. I liked that to spin for a sock yarn, and I liked to knit a sock yarn with it. And no one was producing that at the time. It wasn't the hot ticket thing that it is now to try to find a produced sock yarn, all natural, but reinforced with something beyond nylon or silk. So anyway, and mills were just starting to get into producing yarn for people that didn't require such a huge amount of fiber, you know, that a farm flock could have produced. So I discussed it with my husband, and he thought I was crazy to take away a guaranteed sale and keep the fleeces for ourselves to have made into yarn, but I was determined. I wanted to give it a try. And so in that particular year, I saved all of my white Corriedale fleeces, didn't sell them. I bought from a neighboring farm white alpaca fleece, and the blend that I'm talking about that I really preferred for spinning was anywhere from 10% to 20%. So not much more than what you would get in a standard commercial sock yarn for the nylon content. So these were coated fleeces, very clean and long staple length and some fairly clean alpaca. And I sent them off to the mill to be made into a 3-ply sock yarn, so fingering weight, and was so excited. And not much time passed, and a large box came from the mill, and I opened it up, and this skein is an example of what I found. And I'm going to try to hold the camera steady and put my hands through this. I think it's kind of self-explanatory to you. You can see, you know, this is all in one skein, and this is fairly representative of what the skeins look like. Thick and thin, underspun, and overspun. Some places where it would actually even drift apart. You see that if it'll focus here? Let's see. And I was just heartsick. And then I got a frantic call from the mill as I was trying to decide what I should call and say. And very apologetic. They had an inexperienced person running the spinning machine, and it was messing up, and rather than stop, they just kept going. So we had stops and starts and breaks and slubs. And the mill made it right with me financially. They didn't charge me for this. So they were out too, money-wise. But I was out a year's worth of fleece and the money that I would have made on selling those fleeces right off of the sheep. So that was a real punch to the stomach. It's a typical thing for farmers. It's a risk, just like planting a crop that may not grow well. You've spent the money for the materials, and then you have nothing to show for it, or a loss. I have knit with this yarn, we have, but it wasn't something that I would have sold. So that was my first step into trying to have a farm yarn produced. So I needed to take another year before I'd have fleeces to be put into yarn again, if I decided to do that. In that following year, another company, a fairly well-known yarn and knitting company, came out with a Corriedale yarn. Not one that they raised themselves, but they did come out with a Corriedale yarn. And I felt at that point, well, it's almost going to seem like I'm just copying them. So I abandoned the idea. There, that's focusing pretty well on it. I abandoned the idea then and just took the financial loss, knit with the yarn some, but didn't sell it. And so, as I say, you know, and I couldn't be mad at the mill. Mistakes happen. You know, people are people. Machines are machines, and so these things can happen, and they did the best they could for me as far as to make it financially right. So then went along quite a long while and didn't have yarn done again. The second time that I decided to go ahead and give another try of having some farm yarn made, I actually went together with my sheep mentor, the woman who helped me get started with Corriedale sheep. And we went together and we wanted to have a gray yarn, a yarn spun from our gray Corriedales. And she was a pattern writer as well, and so she was thinking of maybe some things in kits, and I just wanted to have some nice gray yarn. So we went with a different mill here in Michigan, not the one who produced the white yarn, but a different mill. And at the second mill, the second go around, they required a very large number of pounds to have yarn spun. And that was one of the reasons that we went together. And so we kept our gray fleeces. We went and spent a lot of time talking with the people who did the actual spinning, talked about the characteristics of Corriedale, what can happen, what we wanted. They had examples to show us of what could be spun. We had examples of what we wanted. Had a great time visiting and talking about it all. And so left with a hefty deposit on what we wanted to have done and waited. And it didn't take very long for them to spin that. I will say that. We were talking about having a 2-ply, a nice lofty yarn. We wanted a 2-ply DK weight. And you know, we gave all the warnings and were assured that it was understood that Corriedale is one of those wools, and there are several that have what I call, for lack of better scientific term, the poof factor. That when you wash a lock of Corriedale, when you spin a yarn and then wash it from Corriedale, that it's gonna poof up. It's lofty, it has good crimp, it's, I guess, full of air. You know, you've got that air quality, so you get a lofty, light, bouncy, squishy yarn or fiber. And so we talked about that. And so when this yarn was done, we got a call from the mill to say it was a beautiful yarn in just the DK weight that we wanted until you washed it. And then it plumped and softened and became really an Aran or a bulky weight yarn. It's a beautiful yarn. You're seeing an example of it here. But it's really, this is about 8 wraps to the inch. And I think 8 wraps to the inch is considered bulky. So here it is, a beautiful yarn. We paid full price for this because it was a beautiful yarn and beautifully spun, even though it wasn't what we'd ordered. It was a lot of money. I have used it over the years, and it's nice to work with. But in my experience, bulky yarn, chunky yarn, bulky, doesn't sell that well. For one thing, the skeins are less yardage. They're big fat skeins, but like in this case, it would have been 250 yards for a sport or a DK, but for this, they were 170 yards in a skein. And so, you know, when people are buying that and that looks like, you know, you're spending a lot more money for what you're going to have. And people at that time that we had this done weren't making like the kind of bulky colored yoke sweaters that they are now. Maybe if I had this yarn done now, it would probably sell really well. It didn't at the time. I ended up buying out my friend even because she just didn't want to deal with it. And so I had quite a lot of it. And, you know, over the years, it's sold here and there. I dyed some. I've made a few things with it. And so that was another one. So although it wasn't a total loss, it still wasn't what we were anticipating and what we had ordered. So totally different mill from the white that I showed you first. And a year's worth of gray fleeces from 2 farms. And that was what we got. But it's a beautiful yarn. It would probably be really popular today. It takes dye beautifully too. So that was my second experience having yarn spun. And now to our most recent yarns, just back from the mill a short time ago. These 3 skeins that I'm about to show you are from a different mill, a new mill in the area that's starting up. And I'm excited to work with her, and she's trying her best to learn and working on her own for the most part. And so I'm going to keep using this mill. I'm going to keep working with her. But I have had some issues with the first batches that I took to be processed into yarn. This first one may not show up very well. It's pretty dark. It's almost black in real life. But it's 50% Finn sheep wool and 50% Corriedale wool fleeces. And these were, all 3 were supposed to be 2-ply DK weight yarns. This 2 of them came back as 3-ply, 1 is a 2-ply. And they all are thick and thin, and most of them have over twisted areas. This one, I think you can see, without me having to point it out too much. And it's not just like a few occasional spots. It's all throughout the 250-yard skein. Some places nearly as unspun enough as to almost drift apart. And on this one, a tremendous amount of loss, more than I've ever had with anything before. These were coated fleeces and strong fleeces, and I lost about 60% from what I took in to what I got back. And I'm not sure why. We're not sure why. If it was in, we're just not sure. But that makes this a pretty expensive skein of yarn. So that's one. The second one is Morat Bond and Corriedale and red alpaca. And the same thing, only there also are more exaggerated spots of the over twisting. That's where these skeins have all been washed. So you see. And then this. Not as much loss in this one, from pounds in to pounds back, but still kind of random fleeces, or skeins, I'm sorry. And then the third one was finally getting the knack for, I think, for the most part. There was, again, quite a lot of loss on this one, but it is a 2-ply. This is 100% Corriedale from a mother-daughter pair, and is really nice in about half of the skeins. And then the other, this doesn't have the slubs so much, the untwisted, but the over twisted. And you see that this is so over twisted that it just wants to kink back on itself essentially. And again, that's a washed skein. But a few skeins there that were good, kind of like this looks here, pretty good. Now there's a slub, real big slub. And so I did have some of these for sale, but they've all already sold. So those are our latest 3. I have one more batch of fiber out being made into yarn that I went together with my neighbor who raises alpacas. So it's 50% wool and 50% alpaca that we're having a 2-ply sport weight spun of. And with that, we took it in February of 2018, and part of the problem that part of the dilemma we're facing. It's a good thing. So many people are using the small mills now to be able to have yarn spun, whether they're shepherds or whether they're buying fleeces, maybe at a fiber festival or from a farm, and taking them to be spun. But it's making a tremendous amount of business for the mills, which is terrific. But it's also meaning that there's a longer and longer wait time to get your yarn back. We took this batch, as I started to mention, in February of 2018, and we were told it could be a 6-month turnaround time. That's not too bad. But then along in November, December, when we hadn't heard anything and we started to call, then we found out that it probably was going to be February of this year. So a 1-year waiting time. And that's not unusual right now, with at least the mills here in Michigan that we've dealt with. And so if you think about that, then when you take your fiber in, you pay a deposit for it to be done. So there's your money is tied up there, and your fiber is there for a long time, and then it comes back. And then, if there is an issue like what we're seeing in these 3 skeins, then there's a financial hit. Or even if it comes back beautifully, then, there's money that's been tied up for 8 months, 10 months, a year. And so for us, especially as a really small producer, and as really just a step above a hobby farm, just doing this to create a little income and to get yarn out there in the knitting community, it's really not worth it at this point. And I wanted to make the announcement that I think at this time, for us, for our farm, we won't be sending anything else out to be spun into yarn. Not to say that that won't change here in the future, but especially because we are down to just the 11 sheep. I'm working hard to keep them coated and keep the fleeces clean. And I think I'm just going to go back to my roots, or where I started with just trying to send out to sell and get into your hands raw wool so that you can work with Corriedale in that fashion. If you want to have some sent to a mill to be spun, then that would be something that you could do, or send out for roving so that you can spin it yourself. I probably will have some roving done too, if I don't sell the raw fleeces. In the past, traditionally, we've sold out of those. So that's what I'd like to do, is just keep a little for myself and sell the rest. That's the plan going forward. So that was one of the things I wanted to tell you about, to make that little announcement, that you won't be seeing yarns from us. And even if I did decide to do yarn, you wouldn't be seeing it for about a year, because it's probably going to be that long before it comes back from a mill. So what we have available is listed, and once it's gone for now, folks. So maybe take a look at what we have on the website and see if there's anything there that interests you, or contact me directly to see what we might have. There's Kelly in the middle and Hilda and Marjorie on the side. Now Marjorie takes after a more modern Corriedale, I think. She's the biggest sheep I've got. Her head's not quite so broad, short and broad. She's got a longer muzzle, a little wider between the eyes, or a little narrower between the eyes. She's got the black points. And Hilda's really a throwback. But now this is a Corriedale head to me. Broad, with fairly small ears to the side, the black points. That's a funny looking Corriedale. Right, Ninja? That's because Ninja's the fin sheep, as is Sushi. Pretty girl. Poor Hilda. I know you don't like those fin sheep.